Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest edition of the Labour Future podcast. My name is Brendan Chilton. I'm the Director of Labour Future, and we have here my co-host, Joe Jarvis. Say hello, Joe.
Hello, Brendan. Hello, everyone. Lots to talk about since we last spoke, I think, isn't there? Looking forward to the discussion
just a bit has
today.
happened.
Yeah,
just
lots
a bit.
has happened.
How have you been?
Yeah, not too bad. Yeah. Been kind of looking forward to lockdown finally seeming to be over to a certain extent. I know there's still restrictions in place, but I mean, the football's back, so that's one thing, isn't it? Keep me entertained in the evening. But yeah, lots of serious stuff.
Have you identified your bubble companion yet?
I haven't. I don't think anyone wants to bubble with us. How offended are we?
Oh, that's terrible, isn't it? Can you believe? A
couple of single friends who, we've seen a bit of. It's good for them. But yeah, lots of serious stuff to talk about, obviously. The Black Lives Matter protest, Johnson's response to those, and of course, Marcus Rashford's star role in the free school meals U-turn. And as a Liverpool fan,
Absolutely.
I think it's his greatest ever achievement.
Well, we're joined today. We've got a very special guest to talk to us about these issues today. We are joined today by Stephanie Peacock, who is the Labour MP for Barnsley East and the Shadow Minister for Flooding. Hello, Stephanie. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, it's good to join you. How are you doing?
Very well. How have you been coping through COVID-19?
Yeah, all right. I know it's been tough for everyone. It's obviously been a really strange few months, but, as you said, things are slowly, coming into recovery, aren't they, and getting back to a new normal.
Well, yeah, whatever that new normal is. So now you were a former teacher before you became a Member of Parliament, weren't you? So,
yeah.
I mean, what's your take on this fiasco over the free school meals thing? I mean, what a sham.
Yeah, completely. I mean, having taught secondary school history and politics, you could tell, I taught kids from ages 11 through to 18, and kids being hungry in the classroom is a real issue, and it always has been, sadly. I was a teacher at the start of the coalition government, so just as Labour left office, and we saw the Building Schools for the Future money taken, the educational maintenance allowance go, and all the sort of bit of support that people have come to rely on. And when you're teaching a class of 30, you can tell the kids that are struggling, and it has an impact on how they learn. And I'd like to see us move forwards where we could have, free school meals for all kids. For lots of reasons, that's not always, we haven't got to that point yet, but it's obviously the right thing to do to extend these vouchers across the summer holiday. I was surprised that the government took so long to do it, and the way they've sort of handled it.
Steph, it's great to have you on. Thanks for coming on. It's great to get your kind of unique perspective, being a teacher and then an MP. Have the government taken this issue of the very poorest children seriously enough during the crisis? I mean, there's a lot of talk around, the fact that the very poorest children have, difficult home lives, and has there been enough focus in terms of giving them priority, I guess, in terms of getting them back into school?
No, I don't think they have, and I think to an extent, those kids have been forgotten. There were nearly 3,000 children in Barnsley East, where I represent, on free school meals. And it's not just about having, a hot meal once a day that's nutritional. It's also about being in school and learning and interacting. And if you look at the statistics, around 70% of kids in private school, if not more, will be attending online lessons where they sit down like this and they basically take part from home. And that just isn't happening in state schools. And that's not a criticism of state schools. It's the government need to put more resources. And one of the things that I've pressed them on over the last few weeks and months is this commitment to online support and to laptops. Mid-April, they made, quite a firm declaration that the poor kids, vulnerable kids, would get access. And I had a meeting with the minister a month later, and they hadn't even been delivered. And I'm speaking to schools in my area last week. There were ones that still hadn't had any laptops received, and that makes a huge difference, because if kids, there is a distinction between vulnerable and between poor, but kids who aren't going to school and perhaps aren't getting as much support and homeschooling could certainly keep informed and keep in an educational setting if they were able to access it from home.
Sure. And do you think there's a concern amongst teachers locally near to you and the council and other figures that it's going to take quite a long time for those kids to catch up? And do you think there is going to be plans in place to help those kids, catch up on their education?
I mean, I've been in touch with local schools throughout the crisis, and it's interesting talking to a variety of head teachers. They're keen to point out that the schools haven't actually closed, that they've been working and the teachers have been working in lots of areas really hard to keep classrooms open for the pupils of key workers. And so there's a huge amount of pressure on teachers who are trying to juggle keeping a school open for certain kids, checking in with those at home, and thinking about how they plan for bringing schools back properly. And it will take time to make sure that we can do it and we can return to what is some sort of new normal, where there can be social distancing and we can make sure it's safe for pupils and for teachers. But there's no doubt that is going to take time.
I don't know about YouTube. I mean, I'm of the view, when we knew this crisis was coming, they built these field hospitals. Credit to the government, they got them up, they got them built. But it just seems to me as though education has kind of been totally forgotten. We know we're going to have to socially distance children for some time. School buildings are only a certain size. There's not been any real plan for expansion of classrooms, physical expansion or temporary mobile learning units. It's just that we've forgotten the education sector altogether. My view, anyway.
You're absolutely right. It was very impressive to the Nightingale hospitals across the country, and the increase the capacity was a real achievement. And you're absolutely right. The same sort of focus could be applied on schools, and also be more creative, looking at other spaces. And it won't work everywhere, but there are museums not being used. There are football stadiums are available. There's all sorts of different spaces where we could be creative. Again, there will be a divide. That's presumably easier to do in London than it is in other places. But we could be creative and look at other and different spaces so that kids can get back to school and it can be safe for them and for teachers to do so.
Steph, I'm not sure about your views on devolution, but with my English Labour network hat on, and us being very focused on kind of English devolution and what more can be done there, do you think it would be beneficial for us to have a less centralised model in this country, to try and handle this, particularly in this kind of crisis, for kind of councils or whatever body it might be, to have kind of more power to do things in their own way?
I think we have seen that to an extent. Different councils taking different views, for example, on the issue, of schools. I met with the leader of my council a few weeks ago, and he shared the concern about making sure we can get kids back into school, and and being particularly keen that they're not left behind and that attainment gap doesn't grow. In Barnsley, only 9% of kids on free school meals go on to university, so that attainment gap's very real and has a big impact.
Well, it's a fascinating subject, and I think it's probably going to rattle on over the summer and particularly into the next term. But I want to move us on now to our next topic, if I may. Now, the big issue in Britain in the past few weeks, apart from COVID-19, has been the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in London, and particularly the government's response. I'd be interested, Steph, in your views on what you think, or how you think, rather, Boris Johnson and the government have handled this, because it seems to me as though it's not necessarily concerned with dealing with the issues that are being raised, but rather more stoking up a cultural war and appealing to their own base. So what do you think on that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely truth in that. We can't ignore the hurt and the feeling and the passion that has been involved in these protests, and why people feel strongly and have been out protesting, the vast majority peacefully, and raising and helped to put a spotlight on some really important issues that have been sort of forgotten for too long, or not had the correct attention put on them. And it does strike me, like you suggest, that the government haven't then engaged with those issues, but rather tried to shift the spotlight on something different, or around sort of a culture type war.
Yeah, no one in Westminster. Sorry, Joe. Go ahead, mate. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to point out that obviously we've seen a few examples of this. We saw, I think Boris wrote a piece in the Telegraph, which is all about defending the Churchill statue. And as far as I'm aware, there's no public figure arguing for Churchill's statue to be removed. There's no movement for that. There might be a few individuals who have got a bit carried away, in a certain part of the left, but overall there's been no kind of movement for that. And that was clearly it felt like a bit of a baiting, didn't it? A bit, almost a trap for Labour. I'm going to take this position over here. Are you going to go and take the opposite position? Are we going to have a culture war about this? And actually, it feels like Keir's handled that very well in terms of taking a sensible position where he's supported the cause of Black Lives Matter 100%, taken the knee, done all this, all these things. But actually, he's not going to get behind the kind of damaging of statues or anything like that. I suppose my question in this is that how much of a trap is this for Labour? And we look at the DFID issue as well, with rolling DFID into the FCO, the kind of almost an attack on foreign aid there. That's the way it's being portrayed. How much of these things are a trap for Labour, and how much do we have to be careful that we don't get drawn into that culture war that Boris wants?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And if you look at that Telegraph article and the sort of speech that Boris Johnson put out around the issue of the Churchill statue, it was around obviously the statue being boarded up for its protection. I believe that Nelson Mandela's statue very nearby was also boarded up, but there was very little mention of the fact that it wasn't just Churchill, it was a number of statues in the vicinity. And there's clearly a move from the Prime Minister and the government to shift the focus, and as we've said, not to engage in those important issues, but rather to sort of cause a distraction and a sort of a false conflict, I suppose.
Sure. And the other thing to mention today is Raab's comments. I think it was on Talk Radio earlier.
Yeah.
When he talked about, he was asked whether he was going to take the knee, and he was, and he said he only does that for the Queen and for the missus when he asked her to marry him. So it felt like a bit of another example of, who that comment's aimed at. It's aimed at a certain demographic of people who may have voted Tory in the last election, of the kind of base, if you like. And I suppose it's a bit of a pattern that we all need to be aware of. And not sure who that's coming from in Downing Street. We can speculate that it's Cummings. It feels like a kind of Cummings tactic, doesn't it? But I guess, it's just interesting. It's also interesting to know, Steph, if you think that this stuff will appeal to the type of voter who, in your area and across the Red Wall, and who was Labour before, but then perhaps went through the Brexit or the Tories. Do you think that kind of stuff, that kind of tactic, will resonate with them?
I think I'm not sure is the honest answer. I mean, it will resonate with some people, but equally, it's not just in London where people are concerned about Black Lives Matter and the serious issues behind it. And I think people are, they're pretty clever. They can see for themselves when the government are trying to distract them. People have just been through an incredibly traumatic and difficult few months. Many out of their routines. Thousands have lost loved ones, and they want the government to be focusing on that. And that's not to say that they shouldn't. I think they'll have sympathy for why people have come out and protested and are passionate about it. But I think they will be able to see through the sort of fairly obvious distractions when you're not even engaging with the important issues. You're talking about something that hasn't even happened, or something the government can create.
Is it not also, Steph, just a cover for the fact that actually the government's handling of this crisis overall has been pretty poor? Education's in crisis. There's an epidemic sweeping through our social care system. And the reality is, because they haven't got serious proper answers to the problems we're facing, and now we've got a good leader of the Labour Party that's biting at Boris's heels, they're panicking and just trying to throw dead cats on the table to distract people from what's really going on in the country.
Yeah, I think there's definitely truth in that. I think the government have not handled this crisis well, and you only have to look at the tragic number of deaths that have occurred, and as you say, what's going on in our care homes and our hospitals, and very slow way to react to the education system. So I think you're right, they haven't handled it well, and people, if you look at the opinion polls, that's reflected. I think there was a lot of goodwill towards the government to begin with, and they welcomed a lot of the economic measures put in place. But as time has gone on and their decisions have had consequences, people are more discerning and they are more concerned about the government, and therefore, they do see through these sort of distraction tactics, whether it be, painting an RAF jet in the colours of the Union Jack or talking about Winston Churchill's statue.
Sure, and it's hard to tell because you're not out and about, Steph, as much as you would be in your constituency. But have the polls reflected what you've been hearing in terms of a lot of support, a lot of rallying around the flag in the first couple of weeks, but then that slowly kind of falling off and people becoming a bit more critical? Is that a fair assessment?
I think when the crisis first sort of began and lockdown came into place, my office was sort of overwhelmed with emails and phone calls, and we saw our casework go up significantly with people with lots of different questions and concerns and issues, either not receiving government support or wanting clarification on it. That has dipped slightly, and I definitely noticed, in those emails and letters, people welcoming the government support or putting thanks to, in the letters and so on. I definitely think there has been a shift, and people are concerned about how it's been handled.
And presumably, their views will be influenced by how the government handles a recovery. Is it going to be a recovery for across the whole country, or is it going to be a recovery that only helps London and the South East? Or, is manufacturing going to be part of that? I guess those are the kind of questions that matter, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And whether the whole country is going to benefit from a recovery, or whether the focus is going to be put simply, on the capital city. There was a report out about a month ago by the Centre for Towns that placed Worsborough, for example, in my constituency. I think it was the 10th most likely town to experience problems from COVID-19, and it is areas like Barnsley and ones with manufacturing base, bigger manufacturing bases that stand to lose the most, and obviously have struggled economically over the last few decades.
Sure. And is it fair to say it's quite important for Labour to focus a lot of the debate around those issues? Part of my fear, maybe it's just a personal thing, is that as the left kind of tends to normally go, we usually focus on the public sector. And of course, it's very important that we give care workers a wage that they deserve. But actually, a lot of the recovery and the growth and the important activity that goes on through, when we look at the recovery, is going to come from the private sector, boosting the private sector, boosting jobs. I suppose there's a job for Labour, isn't there, of trying to make that argument, not resorting to just a public v private kind of classic debate.
Yeah, we need to do both. Yeah, we need to support the public sector. I mean, take my local council, it's in 40% cuts. It's had the biggest cuts in the country in the last 10 years, and had done a good job, a very good job actually, of managing those cuts and of dealing with them and of keeping a well-run council that supports people. This has had a huge impact on their finances and any reserves they had. So we do need support for the public sector, but you're absolutely right. The recovery is not going to happen unless we get support for the private sector. In areas like Barnsley that do still have a strong manufacturing base, they need that support. And I think, my sense has been people have very much welcomed the initial support and the furlough scheme, but it's obviously what happens after that.
Steph, turning to your constituency, Barnsley, God's own country. I do believe Les Dawson was from Barnsley. He was one of my favourite comedians, actually. But tell us about it. I mean, you saw off a challenge by the Brexit Party and the Tories. You got back in. Barnsley is in that part of that red wall that held. What do people want there from Labour? What do they want so they can come back to the Labour Party and give us that thumping majority at the next election?
So I think, Barnsley's been Labour. Well, I don't think, I know. Barnsley's been Labour, for the last 100 years. And it not to bang the drum for the last Labour government, but it did benefit hugely from investment from the last Labour government. A number of the schemes were piloted. We had Sure Start centres. A lot of the Future Jobs Fund was rolled out there. We saw every school rebuilt. Things got better. They could have got better even further. Obviously, if you'd been speaking to my predecessor 30 years ago, 30,000 men worked down the pits. Now there are none. And where the the biggest private sector employer was the coal board. Now it's ASOS, the distribution centre, and there hasn't ever been a real replacement for the pits and for those jobs that were dirty and dangerous, but they were secure and well paid, and we haven't had a replacement to that. And I think that what we need to see in areas like mine is we need to see investment in good jobs, in skilled jobs. We need to put more money back into early years, because that's how we help the next generation. Things like we've talked about, free school meals and closing the payment gap. And transport's a huge issue. Barnsley sits between Sheffield and Leeds. It's only sort of less than 20, 30 miles, yet it will cost you £160 a month to commute to Sheffield or Leeds, and you'll be getting on a train that's decades old. It'll probably be cancelled. It'll be completely crammed. You won't be able to rely on it. And so we need a good transport system in terms of our trains, but often what's forgotten about, is our bus network. If my constituents use public transport, they'll most likely use the bus. And increasingly, since deregulation of the buses in the 80s, we haven't got a bus network that is there to kind of support local people as a service. It is just for profit, and therefore it's increasingly diminished. So I think there are a number of things that people want. They want good jobs, they want good education, they want a good transport network, and all of that feeds into investing in areas like Barnsley.
And presumably there's a real opportunity for Labour here. I mean, obviously the Tories have got their levelling up agenda, but I don't know about you, the budget that came out just before the pandemic really hit, it felt still very kind of city centric, like it was the town, the way you support town is just by getting people to get on a train and go to a city to work and that kind of thing. It didn't feel like it really got the town's agenda. So presumably there's a real chance for Labour to do that. I know you supported Lisa Nandy during the Labour leadership election, and obviously she was very focused on that. I just wonder if that's a kind of a real route back for Labour to grab that town's agenda and run with it.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think, towns have been forgotten and left behind. And some of the issues, I've just touched upon would make a real difference. And it isn't just about saying we're going to invest in our big cities. We do need to invest in our towns. We need to increase the connectivity between cities and towns. It's stuff like, tackling, getting good broadband, increasing, often towns will be quite rural. So I represent a collection of villages and towns. So actually, a lot of my constituency is something like 70% rural, but that often is lost in the sort of discussion. And so I think there are a number of things that Labour can do and an offer that can be put forward at the next election that can win voters back.
Well, I think that's a lovely optimistic note. Actually, I think that's perfect, because
can I just chip in and ask around? To one more question. I
wasn't wrapping up yet.
Oh, you weren't. Oh, sorry. It sounded like we were done.
Anyway, you've interrupted me now. Carry on.
Sorry, mate. I was just going to ask around some of the less economic stuff and the more values-based side of things. In terms of, do we think Labour's been seen in the last couple of elections as being patriotic enough, of caring about the kind of national interest, of really believing in Britain? Is that something we've struggled on? So it's a slightly loaded question. You can probably guess my opinion on that. But from a Barnsley perspective, is that an issue?
Yes, to an extent. I think Labour could have done more, and I certainly have always been big supporter of the armed forces. I've taken part in the parliamentary armed forces scheme, where you have to put on your combats and go and learn about what our service personnel do, and I've learned a lot from doing that scheme. I find it really interesting, but I think there is big support for the flag, for the army, and so on in areas like Barnsley. And I think Labour has got a patriotic story to tell, and we do need to do more of that.
Sure. Sorry, Brendan. Go for it.
No, I was actually going to move on to that myself, Joe, but you beat me to it, so it's fine.
Am I? Sorry.
Never apologise. It was great to see, I think, this year, Sir Keir Starmer congratulating and praising our veterans in the Telegraph on the VE Day commemorations. I mean, I personally think Labour shouldn't be frightened of writing in the Telegraph or any other newspaper because the whole electorate reads them. So I think, Steph, you're absolutely right to touch on this. So you were actually a soldier, sort of temporarily.
Not quite. I certainly
Private Peacock.
They said I was a natural with a machine gun.
Oh God.
Well, if that doesn't put the fear of God into the Tories, nothing will. Well, listen, I think we are now actually getting close to our limit, aren't we, Joe? I think, are we nearly there? Or
I
we
think,
got some more time?
Whatever you want to do, Brendan.
Steph's
We can carry on chatting. I imagine Steph's got more important things to do than chat to us.
Running the country. Yeah. Well, Steph, listen, thank you so much for joining us. And it's been a real pleasure. We hope you've enjoyed it. And we'll share this everywhere. We'll also share a link to your constituency website for your profile as well, so people can see more about you. Listen, thank you so much for joining us. Joe, pleasure as always, mate.
Brilliant. Pleasure, Brendan. Thank you, Steph. Cheers, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye, everyone.